was the ending of the Ten Commandment passage, which went after the Ten Commandments were listed. Also talked about the kind of referred to at least the system of rituals of the Jewish people that God gave to them in the Old Testament, telling them how to come and bring sacrifices unto God. And there were lots of reasons that they might come and do that, all of which were to fulfill various expectations, requirements that God had for them. There was also a connection that there's always a connection here between the way that the priest got their living and got food actually partly came from these sacrifices. After they were burnt up to the God, the actual meat was shared with the priests got to use that either to eat or to sell. So there was a kind of a financial transaction in the system as the only way that the priests were supported. So it wasn't entirely just about burning these sacrifices, but so it was a sacrifice that supported the temple as well as a commitment of one sort or another to God. We hear about this probably first in the Gospels, when Jesus and his parents, when he was 8 days old. Jesus didn't actually come himself, but was brought by his parents as a good Jewish family following the expectations that God had for them. It says that they came and they made an offering of 2 doves. Now, one of the things that tells us is not only that Jesus and his parents were very much Jewish people following Jewish law, but the fact that they offered 2 doves tells us that they were poor. That would be the smallest offering that they could make in order to meet the requirements of their faith, the requirements of the law that they lived under. So we learn a couple of things from that. We are reminded of one of the many ceremonies that start from when you're 8 days old throughout your life that have to do with these animal sacrifices that are considered a way to honor and respect God for various purposes, from confession of sins to, in Jesus' name, to bring the baby and present the baby to God. All of these are things that happen, and we're a part of the system. When Jesus comes, it's not to confront that basic idea of making sacrifices to God, but he comes and he sees that the temple and the people who are in charge of the temple have corrupted it. So for instance, the idea of having these animals there and even the money changes really is a convenience, because people come from all over the world, all different places with different kinds of money, and they could exchange it for the correct money that they could spend then to buy an offering. And probably if they've come a good distance, they wouldn't be able to bring their own offering. Now, a couple of the corruptions of the system are ones that are not unknown to us today. One was that because they had these people here, they made an exchange rate that was higher than it should have been. In other words, the people exchanging money, it wasn't that they were exchanging money that was a problem, is they were exchanging it at an exorbitant price because they had them in their control. They couldn't go somewhere else. The other thing that would often happen, even if you did bring your own offering, the priest would have to cut that open and see if it was an offering acceptable. And almost always, because they'd created this profit thing with the market people, the priest had, it never was. You couldn't bring one and have that be acceptable. You had to buy one, and those two were inflated prices. So here's the issue that's going on here, is not so much that the animals or the money are at the edge of the temple. They're not actually in the temple actually anyway. They're at the edge of that. But the issue here is that they're taking advantage of people who have come with the desire to serve God. And in a sense, they're using God's expectations as a way for them to make individual profits, individual money. We're kind of used to this idea of being a captive audience. If you've ever gone to a baseball game or gone to any place where you go to a stadium or even movie theaters, you're not allowed to bring your own food, and you have to buy popcorn that costs a lot. So this is what's happening. It becomes more critical because this isn't just entertainment. This is people coming from the heart to fulfill the law as they understand it. So I want you to see that the issue here is not about money being in the temple. The issue here is about people making exorbitant profits off of people who come to the temple. It's people taking advantage of people's faith and their desire to fulfill God's purpose for their own personal gain. It's one of the many kinds of corruptions that Jesus confronts in his entire ministry. And so his challenge here is to those who are taking advantage of people for their own personal profit, not for God's purpose. Now, we live in a time when making money and profit is almost a god in itself, and so much so that I know I have to be hesitant about criticizing. I don't want to criticize profit because we live in a world where there has to be a form. There has to be ways of money exchange, ways we exchange goods, and people need to make profits of some sort to make that. It's the sense of taking advantage of people in order to do that. But even more important, if making money becomes the highest priority rather than how we serve people, and you can make money in a way that serves people, or you can serve people in order to make money. I mean, that's the difference, to the point that making the money becomes more important than the people. And I think that's really the issue that Jesus is trying to get us to look at. What are our priority of values? Not to say making money is bad, but if you're taking money at the expense of human beings or even causing human suffering by doing it, or if the making money becomes the only issue. So we have this, I think we have that as our society, a challenge that we have to face is what are the priorities of our individual lives and our community lives and our cultural lives. Now, personally, I just bring one example that comes to mind, and it's not because it's extraordinary, but because it's normal that I bring it to your attention, but it's one I at least have to deal with a lot, and I think you have to do too, and that's the medical establishment. You know, medicine initially was given by what came out of the church because it was the way for people to serve and try to make people healthier. And so that was its purpose. That's why you see all these hospitals with church names on them. Some with still some connection, some not so much of a connection. And if you've dealt with the medical establishment, one thing is true, two things are true, but one of the things is true is that they do a wonderful job. They're very good, and they get better and better all the time at helping us maintain wellness and health, things that are possible now wouldn't have been possible years ago. It's important that they have a way of making income and doing that. At the same time, it's almost like the money changers. There's a group of people that live outside, around the medical establishment, that manage how costs are handled. And if you have ever dealt with any medical bills, you know you get 2 or 3 letters. You get a letter from the doctors, and you get a letter from the insurance company. Sometimes, if you do a reimbursable plan, you have letters coming from reimbursement companies. Anyway, my point is there's a huge cloud of these people hanging around the edge, much like the money changers hung around the edge of the temple. And in the same way, they may even serve a good purpose. I'm not entirely sure. They may be necessary. But again, is that issue of whether the issue is about caring for people or about profit. But that, again, I don't want to pick on the medical establishment as unique. They started out as more of a religious thing, a way of helping, and now they're more like just about everything else in our society the profit starts to become more important than the service. Now, that's not always true, but I think it's a challenge we have to face in our times, and I think that's the point Jesus is trying to make here. Not to put down the process, but the way people take advantage of the process so that it misses its primary purpose of what it was called to do. It seems to me also, as I look at our culture today and as I listen to us, we seem to have come up with a place where this making of money even has taken out our sense of vision. It feels to me more and more that we don't have a vision of what we can become as a people. It's not about what we produce. It's not who we care for. It's not who we serve. Sometimes as you listen to the conversations that go on out here, it seems like that the only thing is how much money can I individually make? Not whether what I do serves anybody, what I do creates anything, whether what I do produces anything. It becomes an issue of being focused so much on making money and the power of money and the things of money that people get lost. Productivity gets lost. The vision of ourselves as a nation and as a culture get lost somewhere in the midst of that focus. And again, what I'm talking about is levels of priority. I'm not intending to criticize the process of making money. That's a part of how our world works. But what's the priority? What's the primary purpose? What's our goal? What serves God? You know, when I was a little boy growing up, this is another just a great example, I think, of where our world seems to have shifted gears since I was a little boy. When I was a little boy, at least in my household, the idea of gambling was so absurd that nobody even considered that Iowa, who was a little bit, higher morally than the rest of the world. This is my perspective as a little boy. We wouldn't even consider gambling. That was something you had in those places where anything was necessary. Now, you all know that since that time, we not only, Iowa almost seems to lead the way in the ways that we can produce more opportunities for gambling and other things. And it's just true all across the nation. Now, the United Methodist Church still has a strong stance against it. It still thinks that, if you look at the official doctrine of the United Methodist Church, as we talk about that gambling hurts so many people that it's not worth the profit that a few make or the profit that the state makes from it. It's even considered often by some to be a tax on the poor, because often the poor are the most likely to think, well, if I gamble, at least that'll give me some chance to make income. So there's lots of reasons where, and certainly gambling produces nothing. It's one of those places where it's all about a few gathering money together. Now, actually, when you bring this up in most United Methodist Church, you get a sort of, oh. Either people, if they are against it, they aren't against it all that strong, or if they go ahead and gamble, they're going to do it whether I say anything or not. It can sometimes become difficult. I know of one town in Iowa where they were going to bring in a casino, a small Iowa place that was like many places a few years ago, and even today, a desperate little place that was losing most of its economy. And somebody thought, well, casino will bring our economy back together. The United Methodist pastor, believing that she should preach what the United Methodist Church teaches, spoke out against that and even tried to start a campaign. That was her last year at that church. Because it became an important issue, it was our understanding of serving people versus income. And the income won. Now, it is important that people have jobs, but is casinos the way we create jobs? Is that the way we create productivity? Is that the way we advance the world? It's a changing environment of where we are today. I'm not even intending this as an anti-gambling sermon. I'm intending this as there is an illustration of where our focuses have shifted and where we focused away from what is our call of service to what can I get out of it. And I think that's what Jesus is challenging here. This connects us to the Ten Commandments, and then the Ten Commandments ask the question, who do you worship? Who do you worship? We aren't like the days of Jesus, the Old Testament, when they say you'll worship only God and you won't have any other gods before Him. That was in a time when there actually were other gods out there. We don't have other gods that we define in quite that same way, but we certainly have lots of other things and goals and priorities that are more important than God. And in fact, as we think of this whole money thing, Emmaus community a few years ago, I have a priority speech, and there's one piece in that that always sticks in my mind. It says, if you want to know what your priorities are, look at your checkbook. That will reveal your priorities. And I think there's some truth to that. How we spend our money shows our priorities. Are our priorities on worshiping God, serving God, God's kingdom, or something else? And an interesting thing about the Ten Commandments, I have always thought, is the last commandment. The last commandment is a commandment that you can't see in anybody else. It's not one that sticks out there so you can say, that person is coveting me, or that person is coveting my car. You can't see that. It's in here. And yet coveting, I just love the story. Remember the story of David and Bathsheba? It's like David took the Ten Commandments and went backward through them. He started with coveting. He coveted Bathsheba. Now, let's see what the order here is. I think the next step was he committed adultery. Then he lied to the husband to try to get him to cover that up. Then he killed the husband. And then he stole Bathsheba. Now, that doesn't cover quite the first three, but it could be that David kind of had a God complex at two, so his God he worshipped more than any other was maybe himself. But it's interesting to see how beginning to covet in our minds, beginning to want something in our minds, can lead us down all these other things that we would not have thought it was possible we would do before. What is our focus? What is our worship? What do we worship? What is it that gives life value? In this passage of Scripture, as Jesus ends this piece about the money changers, he points out that it's not about the temple and it's not about the money. It's about whether or not Jesus is the temple. Is Jesus living in your temple? Is Jesus the center of your life? Not just your faith, of your life. Is Jesus and his call to serve one another the core value that you begin all other discussions around? Who do you worship? Who do you worship? Let's share in our offering.